So in the stack math, we decide to, if we're deciding between min raising as an open raise or 3xing, and this really, how important this is depends on how raisey-foldy our opponent is, right? How often they're going to play raise or fold, or how often they're going to flat call us. But if we knew that our opponent was only going to play raise or fold, and that we were going to want to have a counter strategy that involves some sort of a 4-betting range, and ideally we'd want to be able to balance that 4-bet range between bluffs and value hands, and have some hands that can 4-bet and fold versus a shove. That's not that easy if you're starting with a 3x open size. Okay, so why? Well, let's look at the stack math. So if we raise to 2 times the big blind and our opponent 3-bets to 6 times the big blind, they're giving us a decision. You know, they're giving us. It's basically like if you hit the pot button and they hit the pot button. Anytime the pot button is hit, you're giving your opponent about 2 to 1. And if you figure your opponent's going to hit the flop about 1/3 of the time, then you know we've talked about where the sizing comes from in other videos. I'm not gonna get too much on that, but if we open to 2 times the big blind and our opponent 3-bets to 6 times the big blind, then that allows us to 4-bet to something like 18 big blinds and still give us or give our opponent a tough decision. It still gives us fold equity, but it allows us plenty of money behind where we can fold to a 5-bet. So if we start with 2 big blinds as an open raise and our opponent goes to 6 and we go to 18 and he jams, then we can basically we have the ability to construct a 4-bet range that's polarized. You know, we can still polarize a 4-bet range because we can use the bottom of our range, our continuing range, and the top of our continuing range facing a 3-bet as a 4-bet, and then we can just fold whatever the bottom was and stack off the top of the range, right? So it's pretty easy to play. Not going to be a lot of real tough decisions there. But what if we use a 3 times the big blind open? If we go to 3 times the big blind and our opponent 3x's us, now we're going to either have to make a small 4-bet that doesn't have enough fold equity or really give us good value when we have the top of our range, or we're going to have to stick ourselves to the pot, and we're going to have to stick ourselves to the pot without moving all in. So we're going to have to make a non-all-in raise that if it's jammed on, we can't get away from, or we're going to have to move all in ourselves for a pretty significant overbet. This is bad, right? So that's another reason. All things equal, I just think that the min raise is better for this reason alone. Now you could say your opponent doesn't have to go 3 times your open raise, and that's true. And this is something that he should be thinking about, and it's something you should be thinking about also. And you could also say that your stacks aren't always going to be 75 big blinds, and that's also true. But this is just assuming it is. And the arguments in favor of using the smaller raise size definitely just get better as stacks get shorter. So I'm just using this as kind of like if there's any time that you want to use a 3 times the big blind open raise, it's when you have 75 big blinds, right? But if you do, and your opponent makes it 9x to go, then you're going to be in kind of a spot here where it's going to be hard for you to have a balanced and effective 4-bet range, because you're either going to have to stack everything that you 4-bet, or you're going to have to make some uncomfortable folds when facing a 4-bet where you're getting a pretty good price to call. And if that's the case at 75 big blinds, how much more is that the case at 60 or 50 big blinds? Now if we raise to just 2 times the big blind and our opponent 3-bets to 6 and we 4-bet to 18, we've got all the room in the world. I mean, we can make that 18 big blind 4-bet, and we can leverage our stack, or we can leverage our bet size. We can leverage our stack by using a leveraging bet size. I guess that's the best way to put it. And you could say, yeah, well, what if our opponent doesn't oblige? What if we go 2 times the big blind and he raises to something like 8 or 9 times the big blind, despite the fact that we've only opened for a min raise? And I would say, well, good for our opponent. He probably should be doing something more like 4x. But there's still a problem for him there. Namely, that he's risking an awful lot to win a very little. And that's really the problem that he's trying to avoid by doing this. Or it's the problem that you're trying to avoid him having if you argue that way. If you say, like, well, that isn't true, Navanad, because, you know, I can just go to 8 times the big blind, and then you've got to make a pretty committing 4-bet size still. And you know, I mean, it's not exactly true. because now as the 4-better, I'm in position, and I can cut back on my sizing a little bit, and be a little more comfortable giving you a little bit better price because you're out of position. So it's not, I don't think, anything intrinsically about poker. I think it's just the way the stacks happen to be at 75 big blinds or less, that if you're playing against an opponent who's doing a lot of 3-betting and you're going to want to do a lot of 4-betting, and you're going to want to do a lot of call versus his 3-bets, then min-raising is I think pretty clearly the superior option. The other reason that is because if we're getting 3-bet a lot, we're going to want to flat call a lot of hands too. And especially when we're deep, and we're, relatively deep, 60 to 75 big blinds for a sit and go is obviously relatively deep. If we are going to be facing a lot of 3-bets, we're going to want to probably take a lot of flops in position with relatively deep stacks, and we allow ourselves to do that best by using the smaller raise size. That's another thing, is we can kind of get off of this raise, re-raise, all in, call or fold. We can get out of this scenario. We can jump out of it at any point just by flatting, and we're in a much better position to do that when we're on the button than if we're in the big blind. And doing something like opening for 3 times the big blind, facing a 9 or maybe even 10 times the big blind 3-bet, it's going to make it pretty gross for us with a lot of our range. Like, what do we do there with, Jack 7 suited, or, 10, 8 offsuit? It's pretty bad for us, right? So, but if we use a min raise and our opponent goes, 3 times the big blind, or even if he does go 4 times the big blind, then we can much more comfortably flat with those more speculative hands, knowing that we've got a lot of stack behind, and we can really still leverage that depth by way of our positional advantage. So if for no other reason than this, I feel like min raising gets the nod slightly over min plus raising or 3 times the big blind. And in practice, what actually is going to end up happening, if you choose the 3x open size, is you're going to end up playing less pots, fewer pots in position. Yes, your opponent will make bigger mistakes on average, and those when he does play. And yes, those pots that you play in position are going to be bigger on average. But I don't think on balance it works out. I think min raising and playing a ton of hands while you have position is better. I think it's great that it leaves you a lot more room to flat call versus a 3-bet and take flops in position. And I think it makes all the sense in the world if you're getting into this situation where your opponent's 3-betting a lot and you're going to want to have like a balanced 4-betting range. Going to 3 times the big blind just doesn't do good things for your ability to 4-bet and fold. And if you can't 4-bet and fold, then you really can't 4-bet as a bluff very comfortably, right? Because otherwise you're going to have to just, like, a pretty good rule of thumb is, if ever you're in a spot where making a raise yourself would commit you to stacking it off if your opponent moved in on you, you may as well just go all in if you're going to raise. And the reason that is because if we have a 4-bet range and we never fold to a 5-bet because we are getting too good of a price, then our opponent can decide if he would prefer to flat call and take a look at the flop before making his last decision, or if he would rather just get stacks and pre-flop. So, and we don't have any choice. If he goes all in, we have to call, and if he flats, we have to take a flop. So it opens it gives our opponent an advantage. It gives them an option. It opens up an option for them that we don't have. Like, we give them an extra strategic option without giving ourselves an additional strategic option. And if that's ever the case, then we may as well just take that option away from them and just move in. But when we do this 3 times the big blind, face the 9x, then we're shipping sometimes 75 big blinds into a pretty small pot, right? Like, even if we called the 9x, then there'd be 18 bigs then. So you could look at it like we're shipping all in to win an 18 big blind pot, which is not a good risk reward situation. But it's also not good if the 9x 3-bet comes in for us to go like 20 to 27 times the big blind and then fold. That's pretty terrible and pretty gross too. So for all of those reasons, I think that the min raise is the best. And the last thing that I think is worth mentioning is that, yes, it's probably true that against bad players, they're going to make bigger mistakes against 3x opens. I mean, it's almost true by definition. But I think they're going to make more mistakes. They're going to make more mistakes more often against the min-raise. Versus a 3x open, if our opponent continues 33%, then they're doing what they should do in the minimum defense frequency in terms of not allowing us to auto-profit with any 2 cards. And we've already talked about this. This is not a great way to gauge what you should or should not be doing, but it does have some relevance, and I think it's worth kind of talking about. If your opponent is not continuing with at least the MDF, then you can auto-profit, and you really should. As soon as your opponent starts slipping below his minimum defense frequency requirements, then you really can take 7-2 offsuit and all other hands and put them in your ranges, because they will make an auto-profit, which means they will necessarily be greater than folding. But just looking at it as kind of a guidepost is probably okay. I wouldn't get too hung up on this minimum defense frequency. It's not strictly correct. It's not purely correct that you should be. And I guess that's the thing. It's a minimum defense frequency, and it usually turns out to be pretty close. But we've talked already. I've talked already about how I'm not completely sold on its strategic relevance, but it's got its place, I guess. So if we just know that our opponent has to continue at least 33% against our 3x open, and we look at the MDF against a min raise, I think at the micro stakes, you're never going to have your opponent making that type of mistake. You're never going to find a player that's folding 2/3 of the time at micro stakes heads up poker. It's like, I don't know if I've ever found that player. It just, even if you're using a 3 times the big blind raise, surely he's going to defend at least 33%. So you can't count on him not defending at least the minimum. So he's not going to make that mistake, right? And he's also not going to make that mistake if you min raise. He's not going to throw away half of his hands. So he, if he does start folding 50%, then you should start opening any 2 cards. But most of the mistakes that you're going to get at the micro stakes are going to come in the form of your opponent continuing with a wider range and playing more hands than they ought to. And so the way that we can best, I think, get that to happen is by using the min raise. Because, and I know I can hear people almost hear them saying, well, wait a second, like, won't our opponents make bigger mistakes against a 3x open? Yes, they will. But and aren't they bad at folding, and shouldn't that incentivize us to use the bigger sizing? I mean, yeah, kind of. It does when we have the top of our range, right? We've kind of talked about that, but there's another side to that. And I think what happens is players play so poorly against a min raise, and yes, they're used to seeing min raises, so you would think that they have developed a pretty good strategy for defending against min raises, but I'm telling you that they haven't. At micros and small stakes, I think people play terribly against min raises. You will find tons of players that continue 90+% against a min raise, and if you go to a 3x open against those players, you might accidentally cause them to play correctly. If your 3x open takes them from defending 95% of hands and folding basically like 7-2 offsuit and calling with everything else, if you take them from that to defending something closer to like 50%, 60%, then you've done probably pretty bad things to yourself. Plus, if they're 3-betting any percent, we've already talked about how the stack math works out. How if they 3x our 3x, the stack to pot ratio is reduced to the point where we're not able to wield our positional advantage quite as effectively. And even if we just 3x open ourselves and they do call, it does reduce the stack to pot ratio a little bit, and that little bit can be kind of important when you're playing a heads up sit and go. And when you're playing slightly reduced stack, when you're at like 50 big blinds effective, the difference between a min raise and a 3x raise is not insignificant when called, in terms of what it does to the stack to pot ratio. So the stack math supports this idea that we should be making a min raise. 3x opening reduces the SPR, especially when we get 3-bet and we call the 3-bet. And reducing the SPR is not good when we're in position. In position, having a higher stack to pot ratio works to your advantage. And so the opposite is also true. Out of position means a smaller stack to pot ratio is advantageous, or less bad, I guess, is a way to think of it out of position. 3x opens are higher variance, and if you're starting with the assumption that you're playing better than your opponents and that you have an edge in the game, anything you do to increase the variance is probably not going to be that good. All other things considered equal, you should probably look to reduce variance in spots when you have the edge, right? 3x opens are going to be completely incorrect and bad beyond some, I really should say minimum effective stack size. Like once we get to a certain point, maybe that point's like 35 big blinds, 3x opens are definitely going to be wrong. Like once you have, well, imagine that you've got 20 big blinds. You can't 3x open, because what happens if you open and they just shove on you? I mean, that's what you're doing if you 3x open at 20 big blinds, is you're giving your opponent an awesome chance to just jam on you with a super wide range, and it's going to cost you 3 times the big blind, and you're not going to get to realize your equity. Now, if you min raise, his risk reward goes really south, right? Like it gets, like if you min raise and he's got a, if you're 20 big blinds effective, it's really hard for him to just reshove a wide range against you, because he's risking so much to win so little. And you put him in a spot where if you min raise and he does anything as a 3-bet that's not a jam, then you've turned that situation around on him, where if you jam on him, he's probably going to have to call you, but you also still have the option to hit the call button, see what the flop is like, and then make your decision. So 3x opening reduces the SPR when we don't want to, we're in position. 3x opening doesn't allow us to call as much or as often against 3-bets. And when we do call versus 3-bets, then we've got a much reduced stack to pot ratio, which again is bad. Making the variance higher is not usually something that is thought of as desirable. And 3x opens are just going to be wrong at some point. And this can cause another problem, in that if you're min raising every hand when you're on the button, or you're playing like a min raise or fold game anyway from the button, you're min raising all of the hands that you are playing from the button, and then all at once you lose a pot or you win a pot, the stack sizes change and you move to, I'm sorry, if you're 3xing, okay, let's go back. If you are using a 3 times the big blind open size for all of your hands that you're playing from the button, and then at some point you win or lose a big pot, and you shift from going to 3 times the big blind down to a min raise, and you face a 3-bet, you're not going to be able to know if your opponent is 3-betting you based on the strength of their hand, or based on the way they're composing or structuring their ranges, or if they're just really 3-betting you because they think that you've been making a 3 times the big blind open raise up until this point, and now that you've made a min raise, it looks weak, or at best kind of a polarizing kind of min raise, where you're more likely to have a lot of weak hands that will fold to a 3-bet. So you're going to end up putting yourself at some point into this like rock, paper, scissors situation, which is just really a leveling war, that can be avoided, and that you don't necessarily have an edge in, right? Like if you turn a situation into a game of rock, paper, scissors, when you have a clear advantage and an edge against your opponent otherwise, you've done yourself a disservice. And at some point, going from a 3x raise to a min raise is going to be necessary. And at some point, it may well be the case that when you lose that big pot or win that big pot and switch from 3 times the big blind to a min raise, your opponent's going to think that looks suspicious, but you're not going to know if he does or not. So there's just some problems, and I think there's not enough benefits that weigh out against it. And I think a lot of that just comes from the fact that we're playing 75 big blinds. If we were playing 150 big blinds effective, I would absolutely start with a 3 times the big blind open. At 100 big blinds, I think heads up, I think a 3x open would make a lot of sense too. And we could just go like from 3x to 2.5 to min raising based on stacks, and I think that would make all the sense in the world. But because so much of this game we're going to be definitely playing as a min raise or fold, I think that if we have to decide between 2.5x or min plus raising, whatever you want to do, and 3xing or 4xing or min raising, I think we should choose the min raise. Now, again, I think there's a lot to be said for, experimenting with different sizings. Maybe against some opponents you can even open a limping range, but I'm telling you what I did, why I did it, why I still think it's a good thing to do. But I wouldn't hate it if somebody said, you know, Navnat, I watched your video series and it got me thinking, and I started using some different sizings, and I had an open limping range, but I balanced it. I had a min raising range that was mostly like speculative type hands, but I balanced it. And then I had a 3x range, which was more of my like ace 8 offsuit, king jack, ace king, and some of my biggest pairs were in there as well. And I balanced it, and I also used, like, probably with the 3x range, a bunch of crap garbage. And then I even had a 4x open range, which was like pocket aces and some blacker hands, like king 2, ace 2, king 2, king 3, ace 4, and such, so on and so forth. And if somebody told me that this kind of inspired them to play around with different open sizes and open the limping range and balance this range and balance that range, I'd be pretty happy to hear it. That being said, I don't know if I want to advise you to do that. I think it's a lot easier just to stick with the min raise. Pre-flop hand selection is based on post-flop value for any kind of stacked depth. Now, it could be the case you're in a spot where stack sizes and your opponent are such that you don't anticipate going to the flop ever, and then things change. But starting with 75 big blinds and you know, going down to a lot of the stack sizes you're going to play, as long as there's post flop to be played, you're not going to be open raising or 3-betting or calling every hand. So your frequencies are pretty important, and it's pretty important that you don't open raise 100% against somebody who kind of knows what they're doing. It's probably more important that you don't flat call 100% of your hands or 3-bet 100% of your hands against the button open. So why do we choose the hands that we do choose? Obviously some hands are better than others, but most hands don't go to showdown. And when your hand doesn't go to showdown, how much does your hand really matter? Well, it probably doesn't matter at all. I mean, there's blocker effects, but beyond that, it doesn't matter a bit, right? Still, we're going to use some hands and we're not going to use others, and this is how we decide. Domination rating is very important in heads-up poker. We're going to dominate a lot of our opponent's range when we've got 2 big cards, and the value in domination comes from the fact that, number one, if you have your opponent dominated, it's very unlikely that he's going to win the pot. Like if you have king-queen and your opponent has king-10, it's very unlikely that your opponent's going to win the pot because he has to hit the 10 without you hitting the queen. Like every time neither of you improve, you've got the best hand. Every time both of you hit the king, you've got the best hand. And every time you hit your kicker and he hits his kicker, you've got the best hand. Anytime you hit yours and he doesn't hit his, you have the best hand. It's only when he hits his kicker and you don't hit yours that he's going to have the best hand, barring some weird like straight or flush thing that happens that can't be counted on and won't happen often. So that's a big part of why domination is so powerful. But you know what might be more important, or at least as important depending on stack sizes, is when you have your opponent's hand dominated. So like when your hand dominates a good percent of your opponent's range, when you actually do flop top pair and your opponent hits the same pair and you've got him out kicked, then not only have you made the best hand, but your opponent's made a good second best hand. And making good second best hands in no limit hold'em is a really good way to lose a lot of money, right? If you have king queen and your opponent has king 10 and the flop comes king 7 deuce, it's very likely your opponent's going to lose 2 or 3 streets, you know, very likely. On most runouts, your opponent's probably going to have to lose 3 streets of value in that spot, or make some kind of mistake that would allow you to bluff too effectively, right? On most runouts. So that's a big thing, and that's a reason that we're always going to play hands like ace-king, big pairs, you know, we're never going to fold king-queen heads up, etc., etc. But that's not the only place value comes from. There's also value in having nut potential, and like you can look at domination as having some implied odds and just doing pretty well in the ratio between implied odds and reverse implied odds. Like it's definitely top heavy. It's definitely got more implied odds than reverse implied odds, because really the reverse implied odds and implied odds situation comes up when both players think they have the best hand. And when you have a hand that dominates a lot of your opponent's range, your opponent is most often going to be the player who thinks he's got the best hand. Well, nut potential, like hands that have the potential to flop really, really big, take that one step further. Let's say that the flop comes king 7 deuce and you've got pocket twos. If your opponent has king 10, your opponent's still in a lot of trouble. But if your opponent has top pair, top kicker, like ace king, he's in a world of hurt, because now he knows that he dominates a bunch of your range, and you know that you've probably got the best hand still. So the implied odds go through the roof. That's not to say that pocket twos are strictly greater than ace king offsuit. They're not. You know, all things depend, right? But the fact that and the reason that it's not strictly true that pocket twos are greater than ace king is because ace king is just going to flop something a lot more often than pocket twos are going to flop something. And ace king is going to know where it's at in the hand. It's going to be a lot easier to know if you've likely got the best hand, or if you're kind of drawing, or if you're, you just know where you're at more when you've got ace king than when you've got pocket pair. A pocket pair, like a small pocket pair. If you've got pocket twos, you're just going to have to fold the best hand very often, or you're going to be making just way too many mistakes long term. So, I'm not saying that implied odds is the only thing that matters. Frequently winning pots is a pretty important thing too. So nut potential hands like pocket pairs, maybe to a lesser degree ace X suited, like especially your ace wheel suited, like ace 2 suited through ace 5 suited, and your ace Broadway suiteds are going to have a lot of good nut potential. So pocket pairs, ace X suited to a slightly lesser degree, and then to a slightly lesser degree still your suited connectors, but the suited connectors are still going to have nut potential. You will flop or turn the nuts some very reasonable percent of the time with a hand like 9-8 suited, right? Or at least a hand that's close enough to the nuts. Like if you turn a flush when you started with 30 big blinds, you've got the effective nuts. You're going to play for stacks profitably in pretty much any situation against almost any player, right? But these are the things that matter. This is why we play some hands. This is why we play other hands. Synergy is another factor that leads to post-flop profitability. How synergistic is your hand? Like how well do the two cards that you have in your hand work together? Are they suited? Are they connected? Are they like close enough to connected? Do they have a couple gaps but they can still make some straight draws? How much connectivity is there, and are they suited? Hands that have the most synergy are hands like King Queen suited, Queen 10 suited, 9-8 suited, and like Ace 2 suited, Ace 5 suited, Ace 10 suited. So like your Ace X suiteds have pretty good synergy. Your suited Broadways have pretty good synergy. Suited connectors have the best synergy. They're suited and connected. Suited gappers have pretty good synergy. So where does the value come from in having a synergistic, like suited and connected type hand post-flop? Well, the value post-flop, and remember, that's why we're playing the hands to begin with, right? That's why we're playing this hand pre-flop and not some others. Is because if we do get to the flop, it matters. And that is the basis for constructing our pre-flop ranges. This is another situation where strategic concepts become so interconnected that you really can't just tease them apart and talk about them in a vacuum, because they don't make sense in a vacuum. So when we're talking about pre-flop poker, we still have to talk about how they're going to work, how the hands are going to work post-flop when we do go to a flop. And the reason that suited connectors play so well, and this is something I don't hear anybody talk about, and I think people are missing this. I think that the biggest advantage to playing these versatile synergistic hands is that they allow you to tailor make a strategy on a lot of flops, a lot of boards for the specific opponent that you're up against. If you flop a draw, like let's say you have Ace 5 suited and you flop an overcard with a gut shot and a draw to the nut flush. So you've got like 4 to the nut flush, and you've got an overcard, and you've got a gut shot to the wheel. You've hit a really good flop for your hand. And how do you play it? Like, can you just, if you're out of position and you flat called pre-flop, should you check and call? Should you lead? Should you check and raise? Well, you can't just say that, but I would say probably you'd be hard pressed to find a situation where all of those options are not at least profitable, right? So now we're in a situation where we're definitely going to have a profitable, like it's hard to screw it up so badly that it's not going to be profitable. So what do? Should we just lead? Should we check call? Should we check raise? Well, it depends. Well, what does it depend on, and why does it depend? Well, it depends on our opponent. And the reason it depends on our opponent is because different opponents err in different ways. Like, different opponents make different mistakes. Some players call way too often. We don't want to get very semi-bluffy against these types of opponents. But we have very profitable check calls with our biggest draws, because where fold equity is diminished, implied odds necessarily must increase, right? Because if you don't have fold equity, it's because your opponent's not likely to fold. If your opponent's not likely to fold, then you've got good implied odds, right? So if we have an opponent that's a calling station and we flop a big draw, we can check and call, knowing that if we hit our draw, we've got a real good chance at making a very big pot, possibly stacking our opponent. But what if we're playing against a nit who's just like never going to go broke with one pair? Well, then we can just check raise the flop and bomb the turn and be done with it, right? Knowing that if we just happen to catch him at the top of his range, we're still drawing very live against it. So now we've got the same exact hand, the same exact situation. We've got two wildly different approaches, and they're both absolutely correct. That's awesome, right? Like, both of these lines against both of these opponents will turn a profit. If you're starting with that, the rest is gravy. So that's the really, I think that's the best thing about these hands, is they allow you to do whatever it's best to do against your opponent. Like, against a specific opponent, you have a hand that's got so much versatility, there's so much kind of wiggle room in how you decide to play it, that wherever your opponent's most glaring weakness is, you can just jump on it and really beat it to death with these suited connecting hands. That's where, in my opinion, the main value comes from with these suited connectors and, well, from the synergy of any hand. Showdown value is last and probably least for most stack sizes. I feel bad for showdown value sometimes, but it matters. Like, showdown value is essentially how often are you going to win the pot unimproved. It doesn't matter as often as it matters with these other factors, because the truth is, it's generally not the case that you go post flop and it just goes check, 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 check. But it does happen, and it does happen more in heads up games than in other situations. And if you've got a hand like pocket sixes and your opponent has like ace high, very often, if your opponent's reasonable, very often you're going to get that hand to showdown, and your opponent's going to get, thinking they're going to be like ready to rake the pot, thinking that their ace high is good, and you're going to kind of notch them with your pocket pair against their ace high. So when you can notch an opponent, that's really good. That's like max efficiency, because you're like, let's say you both just happen to be at some part of your check down range. Neither of you feels like they've got incentive to bluff. Neither of you feels like they've got incentive to value bet. So it's going to go check, 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 check. If in a spot like that you get to win the pot, that's awesome. So having more having more showdown value than your opponent in any given spot really can matter. In terms of pre-flop decisions, your showdown value, your hot cold equity, however you want to look at it, and really we're talking mostly here about pocket pairs and ace highs. Although, depending on the situation, and especially in heads up, even queen highs can have showdown value, depending on the run out and what exactly. I mean, like queen high as a hand definitely has more showdown value intrinsically built into it than 9 high. But your ace highs and your pocket pairs are mostly what we're talking about here. At certain stack depths, this becomes pretty important, because, well, let's say you've got 16 big blinds and your opponent comes in for a min raise, you can pretty comfortably shove any ace or any pair, because if your opponent calls you, there's a pretty good chance that you're ahead, even if it's just mildly ahead. And when you add in the fact that you're going to take down the min raise, like the pot, so often that dead money goes into the value side of the equation, and having the showdown value really matters in that spot. Just the ability to occasionally win unimproved matters. This is my range. I plugged this into Equilab, and the range of hands that I'm opening is actually something like 76-77%. And it looks a little bit like what I'm showing you on the screen here. All of our aces, all of our kings, most of our queens, most of our suited queens, most of our suited jacks, Jack 6 plus, 10 6 plus, 9 6 plus, 9 5 suited plus, 8 5 offsuit plus, 8 4 suited plus. What you're seeing here is kind of the bottom of my range in each category of hand. So just take those hands, play them and play anything that's better than them. I did not put 2 plus, but that's pretty obviously going to be an inclusion in the 78% range. But yeah, pocket 2s plus is also going to be in there somewhere. Now, what I do and what I recommend you do might be two different things. Continuing with 50% of your hands is probably okay. But if you have an edge on your opponent, you can do better than this. I think this is the absolute dead minimum that you should be defending, is with half your hands. If you know your opponent's opening like 80%, then you can't be folding more than 50%. If you start folding 50%, your opponent can open any 2 cards, and I don't think your opponent should be able to open any 2 cards from the button for a profit. So I don't try it, even against really bad players. I don't think you should let your opponents do it either, and to stop them from doing it, you do have to use the minimum defense frequency of 50%. So you have to continue with at least 50%. I would actually recommend starting with 50%, and as you understand the pool of players that you're playing against and you better understand your opponent, start adding hands to your range until you get to maybe 60-65%. Now, this is dependent on a lot of factors. How bad does our opponent play? Do we know in what way he plays bad? Knowing he's a fish is one thing. Knowing that he's a calling station is another. How is he structuring his 3 bets? His 4 bets? Does he have an open limping range? And if so, what does it say about his open raising range? Does he have multiple open sizes? This is not as easy because now we're on the reactive end of things. But what I can say pretty comfortably is you shouldn't be folding more than half your hands in a heads-up game if your opponent's using a min-raise, and probably something like half your hands against the 3x. So I think that's a pretty good rule of thumb. And in general, we should just take the top of our continuing range and 3-bet it. Now, when we're out of position, we'd always love to be able to polarize. But if our opponent's going to just be calling us a lot when we 3-bet, which I would suspect to be the case when you're starting a heads-up match at the micro stakes or small stakes, you don't want to polarize, because the way to counter a polarized range is to flat against it more often. So your 3-betting range ought to be more linear. So maybe you're taking like the top half of your hands or the top 60% of your hands, and you're going to continue with them in some way. And maybe you're going to 3-bet like the just top 12% of all hands, maybe top 10%, like a 9 to 12%. It's pretty good. Take the software Equilab out for a spin, and look at what 9% looks like. Look what 12% looks like. Just as long as you're somewhere in that ballpark, I think you're going to be just fine. As a default, of course, you're going to have to adjust. So you're going to want to know how to adjust. And one way we can adjust is if we see that our opponent's playing very 4-bet or fold facing a 3-bet, then we can become polarized with our 3-betting range. And the awesome thing about polarization is it's such an efficient use of hands that you can actually just add hands. Like if your opponent's going to allow you to have a polarized 3-betting range because he's going to just 4-bet or fold, then the way that you can balance your range is just to take some of the hands that were at the top of your folding range and add them to your 3-betting range. That's what's great about polarization. Then, of course, you can still try to stay at that 9 to 12%, maybe at that point leaning closer to 12% 3-betting range by taking the top of your the bottom of your linear 3-betting range and shifting that into your flat calling range, which helps to also kind of uncap your flatting range. So these are the things that you ought to be thinking about. And I think just a good kind of rule of thumb is be around 75 to 80% opening. Use a min-raise, defend at least half of your hands, and really you'd like to get up to about 60%. If you can get even higher than that profitably, go for it. So you need to know not just what hands you're going to open. And I don't mean, when I say you need to know this, I don't mean, hey, look, I'm getting ready to tell you this. What I mean is you need to know this. Like, you need to know this. You need to have this, if not written down somewhere, then you have to have it memorized. You have to know this. You have to, if I ask you, what's the worst hand that you're going to call a 3-bet with? Well, that means you open raised it necessarily, right? If you got 3-bet in the first place. So what's the very bottom of your flat versus 3-bet range? You should have a question for me, and then you should answer it. Your question should be like, well, what's the stack depth? Or what do I know about villain? But this should be the way that our dialogue works, is I should say, what's the bottom of your 3-bet call range, or your call versus 3-bet range, heads up? And you'll say like, well, what stack depth? And I'm like, 70 big blinds. You should be able to tell me, you know. If you can't do that, you're not ready to play for money. And if you're not willing to do this, you're not ready to play poker. I mean, if you want to make it a hobby, yeah, sure, that's great. I want lots and lots of people to play recreationally. But if you want to play to win money, you got to know this stuff. And if you don't know it, I'm going to help you, but you've got to do the work. Write it down, memorize it. This is what I'd recommend. I think this is a ballpark. It's going to depend on things like how well you play post-flop, what kind of mistakes are you picking up on from your opponent, what the stack depth is, what kind of history you have. Are you playing on an anonymous site, or are you playing with heads-up displays where everyone has 10, 20,000 hands on each other? Those things matter, right? So I can't do this for you, but opening and flatting versus a min-raise, versus a 3-bet, your ace wheel suiteds, I think a lot of players make the mistake of default 4-betting these. I don't think these are good hands to 4-bet in a heads-up situation. I mean, the idea that they have blockers and they're going to flop decent equity, that makes them pretty good candidates for light 3-bets when you're playing in a full ring game, but they're just too strong. They're just too strong to 4-bet them if you're playing heads up at most stack sizes. Now, I should say at 75 big blinds, really. Not most stack sizes, but at starting stack sizes. Once you get down to 20 big blinds, by all means, ship these in their face if they give you room to. So, what hands do you open and then call a 3-bet? Well, they're going to be the hands that are too strong to fold to a 3-bet and are not strong enough to 4-bet and are not weak enough to 4-bet as a bluff. That's your range. And that's really all you need to remember. Now you also are going to have some hands that open for a min-raise and fold. That's just the hands that are the bottom of your open raising range. You can look at the percent of hands that you're going to open, the percent of hands that you're going to continue with against the 3-bet. Just take the bottom of it out. That's what you're folding. What are you going to open for a min-raise 4-bet and then fold to a 5-bet? The hands that are just barely worse than this. Right? We're going to be taking the hands that we might consider folding, or we might consider flatting. So we're going to take the hands that are kind of like at the top of our folding range, or the bottom of our flatting range. We're going to use those as 4-bet bluffs, and then we're going to 4-bet all of the super strong stuff. Depending on the situation, that can mean different things, but aces, kings are always going to be in there. Ace, kings probably always going to be in there. Heads up, pocket queens are pretty much always going to be there. So something like jacks plus, ace, queen, ace, king, and a bunch of bluffs, whatever percent bluffs you need to balance your exact range, and the hands that I would choose from. Oh, I want to make a quick little note here. Notice that I'm saying flat call ace 2 suited through ace 5 suited, but consider 4-betting ace 7 suited and ace 6 suited. It's important for you to understand something. I'm not saying that because these are part of a value range. I'm not saying that because these hands are weaker and therefore there's more value in 4-betting these hands. I'm actually saying the opposite. I'm saying that really the difference between ace 7 and ace 6 is pretty negligible. Your kicker is not going to come up a whole lot. Well, the difference between a 6 and a 5 kicker, or even a 7 and a 2 kicker, is not going to matter that much. If you flop top pair and ace 7 is good, ace 2 is probably also good. But the added potential to make a wheel makes these hands more playable than these hands. So since the playability is a little bit higher here, I think they make better flat calls. And since the playability is a little lower here, I think they make better 4-bets that are going to fold to a 5-bet. And if you understand that, then you could probably get your head around why I'm advocating using some of these other hands. And you might be over bluffing if you use all of your combos of all of these hands, but these are the type of hands that you should use. Some combination of these. Because we're going to be polarizing our 4-bet range, we're going to have some weak hands, and we're going to have some strong hands. And because we're in position, right? If we're opening, then our opponent can 3-bet, and we can 4-bet. So if we're 4-betting in a heads-up scenario, then it means we're in position. If we're in position, we get to polarize. Our opponent really shouldn't be able to polarize because we can just flat them. He can't just flat us. Like, if your opponent's out of position and he's thinking, well, I know how to combat a polarized range, I just want to call more often. Well, God love him, let him call more often because he's out of position and he can't do that. Not without losing a bunch of money. So polarization really should be the way that you wield a positional advantage. Now, if your opponent is playing if you're out of position and you're 3-betting and your opponent's playing very 4-bet or fold versus your 3-bets, then you can polarize because your opponent's not flatting you a bunch. But you can't do the opposite. You can't just start flatting a bunch against the polarized 4-betting range because you're going to be out of position. So you don't want to be taking a bunch of flops with a kind of a low stack to pot ratio and without the lead and with a capped range, right? You don't want to take flops out of position in bloated pots without the lead with a capped range. That's probably not the best strategy. So we're going to use a polarized range when we're in position for aggression beyond the open raise, right? Once we have the option to call our opponent's raise or re-raise, we're going to... I guess that's a good way to put it. Okay, once we have the option, or if we have the option to call a raise from our opponent or re-raise ourselves, if we're in position, we use a polarized range. If we're out of position, we use a linear or a depolarized range, a merged range. We're going to take all of these hands and everything better than them when we're out of position. When we're in position, we're going to take the top and bottom of our continuing range because we're going to flat the middle. I hope that makes sense. If not, man, you got to understand this. You got to get your head around this. Here's a good way to explain this, okay? If you don't understand polarization, I'm going to lead you through a real quick little game. Let's say you and I are playing poker with 3 cards. We have a 3-card deck, an ace, a king, and a queen. We're going to ante $1 a piece, and we're going to get 1 card, and we're going to take turns being the player that can either bet or not bet. So one of us is going to have basically it's like one of us has a forced check option. So one of us has to check to the other, and that person's considered the button, right? So they're in position. And the player that is, quote, in position has the option to either bet or check back. What should their strategy look like? And remember, when they bet, then you can either fold or you can call. You can't raise. And let's just say that we're going to ante $1 a piece, and if the player bets, the player has to bet exactly what's in the pot. So when it's your turn to be this player, what should your strategy look like? So there's one hand you should bet 100% of the time, and that's the ace, obviously. And then there's one of the 2 other hands that you should bet some of the time, and one of them you should never bet. You should always bet the ace. That's pretty obvious, or should be. But you should sometimes bet the queen. You should never bet the king. That's the heart and soul of polarization. Why? Because if you have the king, your opponent has an ace or a queen. If your opponent has the ace, they're never going to fold, so you're just going to lose money betting into the ace. If your opponent has the queen, they're never going to call. They know they're beat. So you can't win money with a bet when you're betting the king. But you can lose money, so it's a bad bet. The exact strategy you should be using in that particular example with exactly an ace, a king, and a queen, with just a forced check and 1 bet, and it's got to be pot size, you should be in that situation. The player with the option to bet or not should be betting all of their aces, and they should bet the queen exactly half the time. So they can just go back and forth. Well, randomly somehow they should bet half their queens. Because they're offering their opponent a price of 2 to 1. When they bet the pot, their opponent gets a price of 2 to 1. If you're offering your opponent a price of 2 to 1 in a purely polarized situation, then you need to have a value to bluff ratio of 2 to 1.